Hi everyone, my name is Albert Świdziński. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. And today we have a great honor of hosting Professor Toshi Yoshihara, who is, I think it's safe to say, one of premier, if not the premier expert in Chinese naval strategy, and a person that knows more than anyone else about how the uh, any potential military operations in Western Pacific might unveil between the United States and its allies and the PRC. Professor Yoshihara worked at U.S. Naval War College, was a professor at U.S. Naval War College. Now he is, I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, a senior fellow at the CSBA. Uh, so again, Professor Yoshihara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Professor Yoshihara, you authored a number of books on Chinese grand strategy, maritime strategy, how the U.S. positions itself vis-a-vis the changing face of the People's Liberation Army Navy. But your most recent book, entitled Mao's Army Goes to Sea, which was published just this year, early this year, I believe, deals with how the PLAN was created and how institutionally the way it came to be still impacts the Chinese Navy, and how different the Chinese Navy creation process is from the sort of overall idea about how Chinese military operates. Could you tell us a couple words? Could you describe to us how the process looked and how was it different to a popular opinion?
Sure. I'll say a few words about the premise of the book and some of the main arguments. So, the book, Mao's Army Goes to Sea, essentially tells the origin story of Chinese sea power. And I define sea power in this case in very broad terms. It's not just about the Navy, it's not about the gray hulls, warships. It's also about really any instrument of national power that can be used to influence events at sea. And that would, of course, include the other military services, including ground forces, the Air Force, and in China's case, the rocket force, and how they might be able to be used to influence events at sea. It also includes the paramilitary civilian sector. So the non-military implements of national power are also broadly included under this definition of sea power. And that includes, of course, the China Coast Guard, the maritime militia, the civil maritime industry, the shipbuilding industry, and so forth. And so I take a very broad approach to the definition of sea power. And that allowed me to tell two parallel stories in my book. The first is really simply the founding of the Chinese Navy, which was founded in April of 1949, in the middle of sort of the tail end, if you will, of the Chinese Civil War. So again, the communists were still fighting against the nationalists when they established the Chinese Navy. The second story that I tell uh, is about the various amphibious operations that were undertaken by the People's Liberation Army. So these were land forces conducted by field armies designed to seize offshore islands in order to secure China's maritime periphery. And as you mentioned, I took an institutional approach in looking at the offshore campaigns as well by organizing those stories around the principal warfighting organizations that conducted those offshore operations. So I looked at the Third Field Army, which conducted operations on the east coast of China, and the Fourth Field Army that conducted operations to seize islands off the southern coast of China. And the premise of the book, if you will, is that institutions matter. It's institutions that pass down the institution's corporate memory. It passes down mythologies and narratives. It passes down storylines that potentially have a lasting influence on that institution's outlook, its sense of itself, its sense of its purpose, the kinds of conflicts or wars that it would prefer to fight, or even on things like doctrine and how it would prefer to fight at the operational and tactical levels. And as I told this story, I think one of the things that I tried to do was to overturn some conventional wisdom that prevailed in the West. The first is this idea, the conventional wisdom is this idea of uh, more read than expert. What that bumper sticker basically captured this idea that the PLA was much more interested in people who were ideologues, people who were loyal to Mao and to the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Chinese naval leadership was therefore chosen largely for their ideological credentials rather than for their technical expertise or for their really openness to think in technical terms, which is of course absolutely essential to the Navy building process. And what I found in reading the Chinese literature is that, in fact, while the Chinese naval leadership understood that they lacked the technical expertise, they were, in fact, quite pragmatic in their methods for acquiring the technical expertise, including recruiting former nationalist officers and sailors, basically their former arch enemies, some of them who they're still fighting against, right, at the tail end of the Chinese Civil War. So they clearly were balancing the ideological imperatives of the party with the technical requirements of building an intensively capital intensive project. The other conventional wisdom that I felt the book tried to address is this idea that somehow the PLA was basically peopled by officers who were Soviet automatons, that the PLA was simply copying unthinkingly Soviet doctrine and ideas and incorporating them into their processes for building the Chinese Navy. And again, in reading the open sources, publicly available Chinese sources, is that what I found is that in fact, the Chinese naval leadership were quite insistent that they would only selectively choose Soviet ideas and concepts that suited China's local circumstances. That in fact, these Chinese naval leaders insisted that the PLA had its own fine traditions that they would employ and adopt to have a lasting imprint on the building of Chinese sea power. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, because of their practical outreach, if you will, to the nationalists, they were also willing to borrow ideas from very senior nationalist officers who were, of course, mostly educated in the West, had Western concepts and ideas to contribute to the debate. And so I think what we saw really wasn't a sort of a simplistic picture of the Chinese simply borrowing from the Soviets, but that they underwent essentially what I call hybrid learning, that they borrowed selectively from the Soviets, they borrowed from their own traditions, and they borrowed ideas from their former nationalist enemies to try to engage in this naval buildup. And I think another contribution that I make is that, and this is a fairly straightforward one, is that this just isn't very well documented in the West. These first months, these first opening months of the Sea Power project, the naval project, is really not very well understood. And so I tried to take advantage of the availability of Chinese open sources on this topic to try to present a more complete picture to Western audiences.
Just a small interjection. I spent a couple hours now in the rabbit hole trying to find the English version of the extended deterrence game theory that the Chinese scholars did, but I was unfortunately unable to. I failed miserably, but I won't give up this easily. But if you so you mentioned that the cellular memory, the organizational memory that was established in 48, 49, 49, excuse me, when the PLAN was it still is relevant today to how at the core how the PLAN functions, and I presume by that one of the things that you described was that it was professional, it was not ideological, the way many in the West like to downplay Chinese capacity. It was not the case. So this practicality and being goal driven. What other characteristics where they're noticeable. I do remember the part where in one of the podcasts you mentioned that the man tasked with creating Colonel, I believe, with creating the PLAN, pointed out that he can't even swim, and that's crazy. But again, this is then they went on to find the Kuomintang, right? The people who were capable. So, what other qualities are there, and how they impact how the PLAN thinks about itself today, but also its mission set?
Yeah, so I'll say a few words about some of the stories that I was able to tell through the book that represents elements of continuity in Chinese naval strategy and doctrine and even force structure to a certain extent. So, doctrinally speaking, for example, there is this concept of sabotage warfare at sea. This was actually a doctrinal concept that was formalized in the mid 1950s by the Chinese Navy commander at the time, Xiao who's also considered one of the founders of the Chinese Navy. He was the first commander of the National Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy. This idea of sabotage warfare at sea was basically an attempt to use the lessons that they learned in land warfare and transposing them into the maritime domain. Sabotage warfare at sea is basically guerrilla warfare at sea. And of course, Mao Zedong since the 1930s, had articulated a vision for how guerrilla warfare could be waged to basically help the communists transition from a position of weakness into strength. And he made a point of talking about this in very concrete, sort of tactical terms about how you would do this. He expressed this in terms of active defense, which is the use of offensive operations and tactics for the purposes of strategically defensive goals. And so guerrilla forces would lure an enemy in deep inside enemy lines behind Mao's territory. And then the communists would mass superior tactical mass against that enemy unit to wipe it out. And if you could do that over and over again in a protracted war, you can eventually shift the strategic balance of power in your favor, in Mao's favor. And so that concept, in many ways, was basically transposed onto the maritime domain. So sabotage warfare essentially calls for the use of small unit actions, relying on deception and surprise, night attacks, and close-in engagements to go after isolated or relatively weakened units at sea, and to the extent possible, to engage in tactical battles of annihilation. And that would, of course, if you did that repeatedly over a period of time, you could potentially change the balance of power at sea. And so what is important to note is that while the sabotage warfare concept was formalized in the mid 1950s, what I show in the book is that they were practiced before the doctrine in 1949 and 1950. That we saw communist forces engage in night attacks, engage in close-in encounters. And many of those actions were meant specifically to make up for communist weaknesses at sea. Because at the time, the communists did not have control of the air and control of the sea. They didn't have an air force or navy to speak of. They could not contest nationalist use of those domains. So they had to figure out ways to circumvent nationalist strengths in order to achieve their operational objectives. And therefore, night operations were a preferred method because the nationalists could not use their air power at night. They engaged in close-in encounters because they had much smaller boats, but they realized that if those smaller boats can get into sort of the blind spots of the nationalists' much larger surface combatants, then they can use their small arms to engage in close-in combat. And so these were all attempts by essentially accepting weakness, but then using those weaknesses and turning them into tactical advantages against a qualitatively superior enemy. It's worth noting that when we read about the Chinese Navy's definition of offshore defense or near seas defense, which is still central to Chinese naval strategy, sabotage warfare is actually subsumed under near seas defense. In other words, that concept that was practiced in 1949 and 50, formalized in the mid 1950s, is still with us to this very day. So that's a really concrete example of continuity, that this small ship ethos, if you will, um, is really very much part of the Chinese Navy. If you look at Chinese naval force structure, I think that's also fairly consistent. They continue to use the Type 022 stealthy catamaran, armed with long range anti-ship cruise missiles. The Type 022, you could say, is a descendant, is a successor of the torpedo boats and gunboats that the Chinese used in the 1950s. And so you can see a lot of that continuity that can be discerned even to this day. I think there's a broader, I think, philosophical continuity, which is that through their experiences in 49 and 50, is that they were able to demonstrate to themselves that they faced very difficult odds, faced off against a qualitatively and technically superior adversary, but found a way to defeat it. And therefore, that is very much part of their value system, of their ethos, that they can still win despite their material weaknesses. And that in part is because of their tactical elan, their esprit de corps, morale, the moral factor being a critical component that enabled some of these communist forces to engage in what might be considered suicidal attacks, but were still able to pull off important victories. So I think that also, in some ways, overturns the conventional wisdom about how the Chinese Navy probably didn't have a very good story to tell in 1949 and 50. And what I found, again, in digging through the writings, is that they have a proud history that they believe that they can draw from to inform their thinking today.
And that's very interesting because it's obviously still very much applies to, even though, as you point out, in terms of tonnage and number of ships, but not battle force missiles like the VLSs. Chinese have overtaken the US. But at least in my idea, the conventional wisdom was that a watershed moment for the Chinese, and again, this prove you prove that it's incorrect, was that, you know, the startling victory the US enjoyed in the first Gulf War was the moment where they realized they have to focus on asymmetric, you know, warfare, and, you know, trying to deny the US ability to project power of both aircraft carriers, but also sanctuaries and stuff like that. But according to what you say, the PLA and the plan was created with that in mind, way before.
That's right. I mean, they were sort of asymmetrical, if you will, from the very start. If I document a very important Navy conference that was hosted in August of 1950 to chart the future course of the Chinese Navy, that was supervised by Chinese Navy Commander Xiao Jingguang. And it was at that meeting, and even prior to that, there were discussions about what kind of force would be required to defend China from maritime attack. And they decided that they would pursue a tripartite approach, that they would acquire submarines, they would acquire fast attack boats, and they would acquire shore-based aircraft to be able to conduct what Xiao called a three-dimensional defense of the coastal areas of China for near-coast defense. And again, they did not focus on symmetrical combat power like large surface combatants. They focused on these more mobile, nimble, agile forces to help to conduct the sabotage warfare at sea, the guerrilla style warfare at sea from that point on. And so if you think about, for example, the role of shore-based aircraft, shore-based firepower, if you will, that idea, of course, has now transformed itself, given the technological developments, into the things that we see today. China's anti-ship ballistic missile force, China's air forces that can conduct maritime strike. I think all of those ideas can be actually traced to this much earlier period. In fact, Xiao Jingguang made a really interesting point, which was to say, he used a kind of an analogy, which was that the mainland of China is akin to an aircraft carrier. And so you can project power from the mainland to influence events at sea. right? That's how he thought about sea power. And it's not surprising, therefore, that he not only focused on shore-based aircraft, he also focused on coastal artillery as a critical component of coastal defense. And again, shore-based aircraft and coastal artillery are in many ways the predecessors of the maritime, the mainland, the land-based maritime strike capabilities that we see as a key component of the PLA's force structure. So again, there's a great deal of continuity in terms of the way they think about the use of force at sea, and also this emphasis on asymmetry that you rightly pointed out.
But then, there is that that appears to be a green water, right, component of the Navy. But obviously, when you look at China, you also focus on the aircraft carrier fleet they're building. They I think they limited the amount of ships, the vessels they are supposed to build. But other than the three that are, two of them are commissioned. One is awaiting being commissioned. I think they still have plans for perhaps one more. So this is, and then there is Type 55s and stuff like that, right? Which is a more of a large service combatant. So when, because I understand, I can imagine that the Chinese are not looking to replace the US 1-to-1 when it comes to its role in international order. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. But at the same time, it seems that they're building the capacity to conduct blue water operations as well. So when you, how do you think that would, like what does the force structure that the Chinese are
Right.
building as well is telling us?
Yeah, so I think the way I try to describe it in the book is that this history, this origin story, in many ways can serve as a baseline of our understanding. So at the very least, it could tell us how far does China have to depart from this baseline in order to achieve its blue water ambitions, and Xi Jinping's goal of creating a world-class navy, because that world-class navy is obviously going to look very different from the coastal defensive forces that dominated Chinese naval force structure for many decades. So at the very least, from an analytical perspective, is it shows us a baseline, and it shows us how far the PLA would have to depart from that baseline. It might also offer hints about potential institutional barriers, or perhaps path dependencies, if you will, right, that was set in place much earlier, that might help to form the way the Chinese think about the projection of power. So I would be very hesitant to say, for example, and I make the point in the book, that somehow these traditions and these the early beginnings of the Chinese Navy will somehow serve as a constraint or a barrier to Chinese success. I think I put it slightly differently, which is to say that it simply tells us that China will likely approach global power projection, global sea control, potentially in very different ways than the way the U.S. Navy and other Western navies have conceived of it. It also offers some interesting discussion points of departure for talking about future PLA force structure at sea. Will China pursue essentially a two-tiered navy? Will China need to have a near coast and offshore force structure to defend China's interests close to home? It seems that is in fact the case, because many close by maritime disputes remain unresolved, whether it's Taiwan, the Senkakus, or the Spratlys. And then will that then therefore build a parallel force structure that's designed to defend China's interest far beyond the Western Pacific, including the Indian Ocean and potentially beyond. And then, of course, if that's in fact the case, what are the resource implications of that? Because a two-tiered force may create all sorts of potential inefficiencies. But again, that does not mean that China will fail, right? And in its endeavor, it simply means that China will be thinking about force structure in ways that are different from, say, the U.S. Navy, right? The U.S. Navy's approach has typically been, you build a general purpose force, and in theory, that general purpose force should be able to do everything, low-end things to high-end things. But because of China's perhaps unique historical experiences, as well as its many nearby maritime disputes that remain unresolved, China may have to contend with a higher degree of inefficiency instead of in terms of having a kind of a two-tiered force structure. And in some ways, we're seeing that, right? So if you think about the prolific production of the Type 056 corvettes, for example, those are not necessarily useful for power projection, but they're very useful for near seas missions. They have multi-mission suites that will enable them to conduct a variety of important ASW missions, for example, in the near seas. And you might say that, out of necessity, out of tradition, that China will, in fact, pursue a kind of force structure that's sort of different from the way we've typically envisioned it. And my hope is that this book provides a part of that historical context to why China may pursue sea power differently from the West, particularly the U.S. Navy.
You've mentioned the U.S. force structure and how the U.S. thought about its navy, and again, we still have another fascinating paper of yours to discuss, hopefully, about the lessons Chinese drew from the Pacific campaign during World War II. But since you did mention the U.S. force structure, U.S. Navy force structure, uh, I followed the debate in the US fairly closely, not extremely closely, but fairly closely regarding both whether the US should keep its fleet of 10, 11 aircraft carriers. Um, it seems that the current force structure, and I know this is changing, it appears to be changing, moving away to, even unmanned systems,
Yeah.
but it's still very much stuck on large surface competence, and it's very hard to change this, and it would be a a tidal change. So could you paint for our subscribers, paint a broad picture of how the U.S. Naval structure, Navy force structure is currently looking, centered, I think, around large surface combatants and the idea that they will operate in an uncontested environment, essentially, towards what it should evolve to, whether it should evolve at all. But that's an open question.
Yeah, so I think there has long been recognition based on the challenges that the United States faces in the Western Pacific, that the existing force structure, as well as the operational concepts and the force posture associated with that force structure, is no longer as well suited to the emerging threat environment. Um, with the onset of the sensor revolution that we've witnessed in the past decades, and China's exploitation of that sensor revolution, its ability to blanket the battle space with sensors in space, in the air, on the surface, and even underwater, that it's provided China with a significant amount of capacity to see and hear its surrounding environment. What that means, of course, is um, anything that has a large signature, meaning big things that are big, are going to be found, and that means things that have been at the center of U.S. naval operations, including carriers and even the large amphibious assault ships, are things that are emitting a lot of signals. It's a big signature platform. It's going to be likely going to be detected and seen by Chinese sensors. I think that has, I think, led to a lot of, I think, soul searching and debate about, to what extent the U.S. Navy needs to change the way it operates, change the way it needs to think about uh, the principal platforms uh, that should be the organizing principle for future naval operations. Um, but I think, despite all of the proposals and ideas that we've heard over the years, it goes back to my point in my book about the Chinese Navy, is that institutions and institutional cultures are very hard to change. And I think this is where we are seeing, I think, uh, quite a bit of institutional resistance to change within the U.S. Navy. Um, and so, despite many good ideas about how to move forward, I expect that this is likely going to be a pretty painful process that's going to require a lot of hard choices and a lot of trade-offs. Um, that I think it's raised some interesting views about just how survivable the U.S. carrier is. It has led to, I think, quite a bit of pessimism and assumptions that maybe U.S. carriers can really only operate effectively east of the Second Island chain, so east of Guam. It has also led to, of course, a push to double down on American competitive advantages, particularly in the undersea domain. So building more submarines, it's clearly still an area that the United States has a lead in, and that the goal is to ensure that the United States has an unassailable lead. There's been discussions, of course, about distributed maritime operations to spread the fleet out to make it more difficult for Chinese sensors to track and target, but also create more targets to put more strain, to impose more costs on Chinese sensing capabilities. Part of that approach is going to be augmented by the introduction of unmanned systems at sea, both on the surface and beneath the surface. And so I think there's a lot of ferment going on, potential for change. But how much change will take place? Will that change take place fast enough? I think those are the questions that remain to be answered. I think it was very telling that Admiral Paparo, the commander of Pacific Fleet, recently commented, I think a few days ago, at a conference in San Diego, about the need for the U.S. Navy to take seriously rethinking its approach to logistics in contested environments, and that the U.S. Navy needs to change from a principle of maximum efficiency to an approach of maximum effectiveness. Mm-hmm. I think it's certainly a very important point. In other words, we can no longer count on sort of just-in-time logistics. Those were assumptions that could be made safely when you were able to dominate the seas, when you didn't have a significant challenger at sea. But those assumptions are now coming under increasing pressure. And I think what's interesting for, I think, folks who've been following this stuff is that we knew these problems, for years, right? But again, it takes institutions a long time to make the course correction necessary to adapt to these changing circumstances.
It's interesting from like a systems point of view, whether you can instill this sort of revolution without painful military defeat occurring, like just based on presumptions at the end of the day. From my limited knowledge, I completely agree. I think the U.S. would be in a serious pickle up to Second Island chain in a conflict with China, which is something that many in Europe don't really realize. Interestingly, but I wanted to ask you about the principle of obsolescence. When you mentioned, I'm cautious still again when applying it to aircraft carriers, but I couldn't help but notice the cost effect of the entire carrier strike group, with assets that are basically designed to shield the aircraft carrier vis-a-vis the amount of sorties it can do if it could get close enough to service the targets. And of course, there were many transitions like that in history, but the most obvious one is the transition from battleships, from dreadnoughts to aircraft carriers, right? Which again it took a whooping to really let the lesson sink in. Could you, from a broad perspective, describe the obsolescence, and whether, for example, obsolescence will not be a problem for any surface combatant, manned, like even frigates or corvettes in enclosed seas, and then in more general, whether how you see it's a multi question. I'm sorry, how you see this process in relation to aircraft carriers in this current context, of course, rivalry with China.
Yeah, I think that you would find that there are still many powerful arguments being made in favor of the aircraft carrier, and that it has many uses, and that the predictions of its demise are basically premature. I think there are those who would argue that you just have to think about how you would use the carriers differently to ensure its continuing relevance. People have been making arguments for a long time about deploying, very long range unmanned combat aerial vehicles that have much longer ranges that can be, designed to penetrate enemy air defenses and so forth. And so, thinking about the weapons used on those platforms, for example, maybe one way of sort of extending the relevance, or maybe defending against obsolescence. Um, and of course, we shouldn't forget that the carrier, of course, yes, it's certainly a warfighting platform, but it has, of course, multiple uses in peacetime. It has uses, for things like sea lane defense, for example. Um, it's no wonder that China has invested significant amounts of resources in building its own carrier fleet. It certainly recognizes its vulnerability, but it also certainly recognizes its value. And I think this is a problem that all nations face in terms of the kinds of trade-offs that they're confronted with. If you look at, say, Japan, right? Japan is in a very, very difficult security environment, and that it could potentially call for, a a much more dramatic shift towards an anti-access posture, right? And that would have significant implications for its force structure. The problem, of course, is that when you ask militaries to make those adjustments, you're also asking the political leadership to make some significant trade-offs, because a coastal combatant that can conduct guerrilla warfare at sea is really can only perform maybe one mission, right? Only large surface combatants gives policymakers the option of conducting different kinds of missions, whether it's showing the flag, engaging in sea lane defense, engaging in sea control operations, and so forth. And so, while it's easy in theory to talk about the sort of dramatic shifts in force structure, it comes, I think, with pretty high political costs. And those kinds of calculations and trade-offs I think are imposed on really any country. I mean, even for a country like Taiwan, which seems to, because of the threat it faces, right? It would seem to make sense for it to adopt a porcupine strategy. And yet, if you think about it, a porcupine strategy will produce a force structure that will be very limited in scope. And that means that that comes with all sorts of costs, all sorts of constraints on the Chinese political leadership. So I think, I would think about sort of thinking about these types of shifts in force structure in terms of trade-offs, not just in terms of missions, but also in terms of the potential political costs that a politician will likely face. And I guess my point here is simply to have some degree of empathy for
Yeah.
for political leaders, especially those who actually have to be accountable to their citizens.
Yeah. It's a like a buy note, really, but it's fascinating what you said about the political costs, and the idea that you will defend sea lanes. This is the debate we've had in Poland when we presented our vision of how armed forces should be modernized. And basically, we posited that it makes no sense to have any large surface combatants in what we understand as large surface combatants, which is frigates, because in an enclosed sea and proliferation of precision conventional munitions, it's going to be I wouldn't say sitting ducks, but it might get hit a lot.
Mhm.
And the payoff in terms of the most realistic scenario, like you said, vis-a-vis Taiwan, just doesn't make sense, that the cost benefit calculus. But we are met with insane criticism for that, saying that, oh, we have to, luckily people didn't say prestige. I mean, some did, but it wasn't the main argument. But people raised the, defend sea lanes, participate in out of area operations, and wave our little Polish flag over there somewhere, in the Gulf of Aden or whatever. And it was, from the point of the most probable threat, it's a bad idea, I think. But exactly what you said. Those comments came time and time again. That it's not the case. Like with Taiwan, which is another thing I wanted to touch upon. And Taiwan, and it's seemingly realizing in official statements that there is a need for asymmetric strategy. But at the same time, I think they got a minesweeper not that long ago. So it's a heavy, very politically touchy situation. But uh,
Yes, and of course they've just recently commissioned an amphibious assault ship too that has
that's
come
right.
under
That's what I
heavy
meant.
criticism. So again, right, it's these choices that people have to make to account for a variety of demands that's not just focused on, say, the worst case scenario, which is the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And I think all nations have to calculate all of the demands that they're likely to face, and then having to invest in a force structure that has to meet, that broad spectrum.
But then, excuse my autism, but it's a wrong idea to focus on those things when you have limited resources and threat looming, right? Am
Absolutely.
I wrong? I mean,
No, absolutely. I mean, I think from a defense analyst's perspective, if you're looking at it from, defending the nation from the worst case scenario, yeah, I mean, there's uh, those investments are, frequently seen as not good use of scarce resources. Absolutely.
if I could go back when we started speaking of distributed maritime operations and how the distributed logistics, the idea, but that's also such a huge change for logistical change of chain of the U.S. Navy. If you were assuming that the U.S. would have to fight a war with China, which again, as I think it's a bad idea. But if you were tasked without all the political concerns and all those unnecessary things, if you were to task a force structure and a doctrine of combating China within the first and second island chain, how would you go about it? I know. I'm sorry, but because
No,
I think that distributed maritime operations make sense. Distributed logistics, dispersed lethality. Uh, I'm sorry. I know you're supposed to be the one talking. I'm sorry, but this what you said about CVN and like combating the coming obsolescence. This is kind of going back to basics, isn't it? To them being cheap and disposable. Well, maybe not disposable, but you can build them again, and losing one doesn't equal losing like a $10 billion or something like that, right? So yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Again, I think, these are all sort of interesting and potentially good ideas, but it's all in the implementation. Um, you know, uh, I think what is really interesting too is that there are those who are arguing that because of the outgrowth of the sensor revolution, that whatever can be seen can be killed. And so, even, forces that have small footprints are likely to be found and to be attacked. And so there are some really interesting questions as to just how distributed you can be, in an era of the sensor revolution and of long range precision strike.
So you sound very pessimistic then. There is no good answer to this conundrum then, right?
Well, I'm just pointing out this debate. I think there are those who would come back and say, well, that may be true, but if you are forcing China, for example, to expend munitions in places that they would otherwise prefer not to, then you can really impose, potentially some significant costs, even if they can see and find those distributed assets.
Mhm, mhm. But then we come to the problem of industrial base, right? And capacity. And I think this could be a segue to your other very recent paper at CSBA, which was entitled. I have a horrible memory for titles, but it was Chinese lessons from the Pacific War, implications for the plan. And Michael, because you posited a very interesting question over there, assuming that Chinese would look at themselves as IGN might not necessarily Imperial Japanese Navy might not necessarily be correct, right? That they could in fact think of themselves as the US Navy, which makes sense in terms of industrial capacity, for example, right? When you parallel those. C- could you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure. So, for this report that I wrote for CSBA, Chinese Lessons from the Pacific War, the premise of the book is that the PLA is clearly a learning organization, It hasn't had any recent conventional combat experience since 1979, and so therefore it has been learning vicariously through the experience of others. Now, it made sense for the PLA to learn from the past 3 decades. Many of these expeditionary regional wars that involved, the United States beating up on basically second tier, third tier militaries. That made sense for the PLA at a time when the PLA was, relatively weak. But as China becomes stronger, under this guidance of achieving a strong military dream that suggests parity, if not even superiority, over the most modern Western navies, including the United States. That as China closes the qualitative gap and the quantitative gap in certain areas, that China would emerge as a peer military. And if that's the case, and if China emerges as a peer of the United States in the coming years, then those wars involving sharp asymmetries of power make less sense, that have less analytic salience. And therefore, if China were to want to seek to learn useful lessons from the past, it's going to have to look at past peer great power wars. And so it occurred to me that the Pacific War was a really logical place to look at, because the place that China would fight in the future is largely where the Pacific War took place. The circumstances were also somewhat similar in the sense that the United States would have to project significant combat power from North America into the Western Pacific to conduct those operations. Imperial Japan and China would be basically defending its home waters. And so a lot of those parallels and circumstances, on top of this idea that China would be reaching military parity, made the Pacific War a potentially fruitful case study. And so I broke the Pacific War down specifically in looking at what Chinese analysts drew from the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Guadalcanal, and the Battle of Okinawa. I chose those because they looked at various dimensions of warfare that will be relevant in the 21st century, whether it's a fleet-on-fleet engagement at Midway, a protracted island campaign on Guadalcanal, and then in the case of Okinawa, obviously also a significant amphibious operation, but also looking at the Japanese use of shore-based air power, which is, of course, a parallel to China's use of shore-based maritime strike. So there are these really interesting parallels to modern warfare that I thought PLA analysts would find valuable. And indeed, in looking at, again, voluminous Chinese open sources on their study of the Pacific War, they clearly were drawing these important lessons from the past. And I think one of the things that really jumped out at me was Chinese analysts' focus on logistics. We talked about this briefly earlier in our conversation. And they were just super impressed with the U.S. Ability to maintain that supply chain, to be able to surge the materiel across the Pacific to sustain those distant operations, particularly in the case of Okinawa. They were not only impressed with U.S. forward bases, including forward anchorages in Ulithi and also in Karama, which is off the coast of Okinawa. Those forward anchorages performed all sorts of critical resupply, repair missions. They were impressed with the U.S. at-sea replenishment fleet. They were impressed with the large amphibious fleet that they were able to gather for the assault. They were very impressed with all of the ammunition ships and so forth, the resupply ships that enabled this operation to take place so far from the American homeland. And I think it occurred to me as I was reading the literature, this is to get to your point, is that it seems to me that the PLA does not want to be like the Imperial Japanese Navy, because what they learned were all of the faults, the mistakes of the Japanese Navy, particularly in terms of logistics. The Imperial Japanese Navy was simply not well prepared and structured to be able to conduct a protracted conflict and to sustain operations very far from the Japanese home islands. And that sharp asymmetry in power, particularly in logistical prowess, gave the United States a significant strategic and operational advantage. And so the Chinese recognize that this was, and they repeat this constantly, is that this is as much not just a competition over operational art and tactical effectiveness. It's also about the ability to bring your comprehensive national power, which is their concept, to bear. And the side that has a significant comprehensive national power that is aligned to the strategy and the operation that that nation is trying to conduct, that's the side that's most likely going to succeed. And they point out that by the time the Guadalcanal campaign took place, Japan's military strategy and its ambitions far outran Japan's comprehensive national power. And so, and it's reflected in Japan's ability to sustain itself in that war. So again, in reading their contrasting judgments about the performance of the United States and Japan, particularly in the logistical arena, suggested to me that they want to emulate the United States. And it's not surprising that they do, because if you look at PLA doctrine today, they're not interested, in my view, in studying the number 3, number 4, or even, the number 2 military power, in the current pecking order. They're laser focused on the number 1 military power, and that's the United States, right? That's their benchmark. That's their gold standard. And so it seems to me that in reading the literature, that they really want to become more like the U.S. military. They want to be able to perform like the U.S. Navy during the Pacific War. And so that suggests to me that we need to take this competition very seriously. If my hypothesis is true, right, that the PLA has these ambitions, then we better be prepared for that.
Yeah, and by note, again, if you look at the shipbuilding capacity, not just shipbuilding, but even cranes, right? The US has nothing. Well, it's not that it has nothing, but there is a huge disadvantage, right? So
That's right. So, the U.S. Navy has been, suffering from a variety of, structural changes. So it's structural in the sense that it starts with the post Cold War drawdown, the shrinking of the defense industrial base and its shipbuilding capacity. Many of the shipyards that were productive were turned into commercial hubs. So, Long Beach Naval Shipyard is no longer, the Philadelphia shipyard, the New York shipyard, and so forth. And so what we've seen is a structural reduction of America's capacity, both in terms of the defense industrial base in general, but also in terms of U.S. Shipbuilding. This was compounded by the financial crisis, and then, of course, compounded by sequestration, and then the 2 wars in the Middle East. I think there were a lot of fiscal pressures that made it very difficult for the United States to expand its productive capacities. China, by contrast, of course, is just cranking ships out like they're sausages. Pretty impressive. I just found a really interesting Chinese source that mentioned that the Chinese Navy commissioned 9 major surface combatants in 2022, including cruisers, destroyers, a frigate, and an amphibious assault ship. And those 9 major surface combatants together displaced about 110,000 tons. And the Chinese analyst talking about this statistic said that's about a third of the entire French Navy by tonnage. In other words, China could replicate the entire French Navy at that production rate, just with those 9 surface combatants, every 3 years. Then the Chinese analysts then noted that, oh, by the way, 2022 wasn't even a really great productive year. In 2021, the Chinese Navy actually commissioned ships in aggregate of 170,000 tons, 60,000 tons more than 2022. And then the analyst went on to say that the Chinese Navy was number 1 in new commissionings of ship by tonnage 4 years running in a row. This is just,
Yeah.
there aren't enough adjectives to describe the scale and pace of China's naval build. It's simply remarkable.
And then those are also advanced vessels. They are not rudimentary, right? Type 55s, Type 52Ds. Those are not, a joke, right? They are still.
Yes, the 2019 edition of China Military Power by the Defense Intelligence Agency has a whole section on the Type 055s, and it basically singles out the cruiser as a world-class vessel that is on par, if not surpasses uh, Western naval technology.
And then
Pretty
you look
impressive
at
stuff.
the institutional culture which you mentioned, because the defense over here, and in Europe, where people downplay China's capabilities, would be that, yeah, maybe they did build the ships, but A, they might be poor quality, which we discussed, but also that they won't know how to operate them, and the institutional culture is poor. And you prove that this is not necessarily the case.
Yes, yeah, and I think that so there has been a longstanding argument that even if China can build all the hardware, that they won't have the software to match. And it seems to me that if you look at their methodical approach to developing software, that I think it would be premature to write them off. That they have engaged in, methodical improvements in training and exercises. They're doing it carefully and slowly, but they're surely making progress. I mean, if you think back to their first deployment for the anti-piracy patrols, more than a decade ago, who would have imagined then that China would basically have continuous, uninterrupted presence in the Indian Ocean through continuous rotational deployments of, admittedly, a small surface flotilla, but nevertheless, one that has been ongoing for well over a decade. And imagine the experiences the sailors, the crew, the officers have accumulated over that period. So and of course that doesn't even take into account all of the various open water expeditions that they've conducted in the Western Pacific. That's been ongoing for quite some time. So I would be very careful in sort of prejudging the software side of the Chinese Navy.
If I could just ask two or three more questions, I don't know how you're looking
Sure.
time-wise. I wanted to ask about the allies of the US, obviously an important part, right? We could speak about AUKUS and, the SSNs the Australians are supposed to get, but I wanted to ask from a more strategic point of view. Obviously Japan's doing a lot. It's the word is remilitarizing, but it was a significant military before. South Korea is as well. Even Taiwan is developing long-range missiles. And on the one hand, I guess this is a welcome change from the US perspective to have more capable allies, that it needs, rather than what Poland did during invasion of Iraq, which is basically legitimize the war. But at the same time, shouldn't the US be concerned about whether it will be able to control escalation dynamics should those trends continue in Japan, in South Korea? Isn't this a problem in its own right when it comes to managing how the war escalates, potential war with China? Apart from what
Well,
Park said, from Yoon, I'm sorry, not Park, but Park said similar thing back in the day in South Korea concerning nuclear weapons. That aside, of course.
yeah. So maybe I'll set aside the escalation dynamic for now and just talk about the broader phenomenon that you're describing. I think the emergence of informal coalitions and also the development of um, you know various Asian partners and allies engaging in self-strengthening, and another trend is the frontline states helping each other. All of these trends are, due to China. China has been the stimulus behind this, and what we're seeing is because of China's assertiveness, is not only AUKUS but the emergence of the Quad. We're also seeing our allies picking up the slack, as you're saying, with Japan significantly increasing its defense budget, but also focusing on the right things like logistics, infrastructure, stockpiling and so forth, in addition to long-range counterstrike. Philippines having agreed to access arrangements with the United States, but frontline states like Japan helping Vietnam and the Philippines in their own way, but also forging much closer ties with Australia, at the security level, but also forging closer bilateral security ties with India. I think these are all sort of natural outgrowth of China's growing assertiveness. And it seems to me that that is potentially one of the structural weaknesses of China's rise, is that China is constantly faced with the possibility of being isolated because the United States has these both formal and informal alignments that essentially surround China. So I think China faces a serious strategic predicament, even if its military continues to rise at a rapid clip. So it's in some ways somewhat similar to, say, Imperial Germany's predicament. By the outbreak of World War I, it basically found itself, surrounded and diplomatically isolated by the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia. So China could very well find itself in that situation as well, as the military balance continues to skew in its favor. Yes, I think we should be concerned about the potential escalation dynamics. But my main concern is that we cannot allow concerns about escalation dynamics basically hijack efforts to strengthen the defenses of our allies and our friends. Because I think if we become too wrapped up in some of those considerations, the logic, if you take it to its logical conclusion, then it's to do nothing,
Yeah.
right? Do nothing in the face of China's buildup, and that's a far worse answer, in my view, than actually having some credible operational military options in response to China's potential use of force. And so I think we also need to take into account that China is likely going to be risk sensitive, that it's going to be responsive to risks, and that in many ways we have to sort of test out some of those propositions. And the only way to do so is to do something, right? To see whether China would be responsive and responsive in the sense that they would be more cautious, or that they would be deterred from undertaking certain actions, that they would think twice about using force because of some of the actions that we've taken. And I think we've seen over the past 5-6 years that China is in fact responsive to stimuli and to risk. And I think some of the straw man like arguments about, like, well, if you do this, it's going to lead to World War III, right? I think that's not a very productive conversation, because I think what that drives you to, it drives you towards inaction. And what we've seen is that when we undertake these actions, China will respond accordingly to their risk calculus and to their national interests. And so we have to keep testing our hypotheses about how China might respond, right? It doesn't mean we act irresponsibly. It means that we take calculated risks in ways that we think will produce the desired reaction on the part of the CCP and of the PLA.
I suppose the US has a nice lab right now, or like a field study of how escalation follows in Ukraine, right? And the provision of certain types of equipment didn't produce horizontal escalation. But also, doesn't this come down to what essentially amounts to asymmetry of stakes to the to both warring parties or potentially warring parties, like when you look at Taiwan, for example, right? And whether China would be willing to go to war over Taiwan, which doesn't appear to be its interest. In general, I don't think war appears to be in its interest. But
So I think this debate about the asymmetry of interest, or
stakes.
what Clausewitz called the value of the object, is is very, very important, but it's also very nebulous because on its face, you might say that China cares much more about Taiwan than the United States. But from the US perspective, it's also not that clear that it's such a one-dimensional set of interests that it has in Taiwan, right? Taiwan represents a lot of things for the United States. It's of course geostrategically important. I've made this argument, right? It's at the midpoint of the first island chain. You've got to hold there, right? If you want to ensure the integrity of the first island chain, Taiwan is critical as the midpoint, both for China and for the United States. Taiwan's important, obviously, for its economic role in the global economy. Taiwan's important because of its vibrant democracy and the values that Taiwan represents. We should also take into account allied calculations, right? From Japan's perspective, Taiwan is a critical part of Japan's southern flank. And for a variety of historical reasons, Taiwan has been in friendly hands, either under Japanese colonial rule, then under a strongly anti-communist regime under Chiang Kai-shek, and now a liberal, vibrant democracy that shares values with Japan. So if we care about what our allies think, and if our allies think that Taiwan is critical to the security, to their security, but also to the broader order, then I think if you add all of those things up, on top of the fact that there is one of the rare things in Washington, bipartisan support over Taiwan, that's, if you combine all of those things, that the cumulative value of Taiwan suggests that it's not clear cut that somehow China cares more about Taiwan than the United States. And so again, I think the asymmetry or the presumed asymmetry may not be as sharp as one would make it out to be, and ultimately it also depends on context. How does the war break out? What kinds of choices does China make over Taiwan? That would also have significant implications for the value that the United States attaches to the defense of Taiwan. And all of those, of course, cannot be predetermined ahead of time. Very difficult to judge.
So this is again how the Chinese reacted to Pelosi visit, right? It wasn't amphibious landing training; it was blockade, right? Far more.
And what my view is that there is a limit to the military instrument in changing the underlying political dynamics, right? This is about growing U.S. political ties to Taiwan. And it's not clear to me that PLA military coercion will fundamentally alter the trajectory of that closeness. In fact, it might even accelerate it. So I think Xi Jinping and his lieutenants actually face a kind of a dilemma there. I think hopefully they're beginning to learn that there are political problems to which the military instrument has limited impact in solving the underlying political dynamics of a fundamentally political problem.
But does it go the other way around as well? Because I focus more on grand strategy side of things. And for example, if you look at Western Pacific, at the way US looks at free trade agreements, for example, moving away from them, and China really positions itself, the US sort of becomes a revisionist power when it comes to international economic order to an extent. While China, is all about these days. There was Liu He's speech in Davos when he defended free market capitalism, essentially. But also, China keeps referring to WTO as so it positions itself vis-a-vis the US. When again, what the US does, for example, with Germany, and the way it's trying to pressure Germany into limits its ties with China. So the Chinese posit themselves as a more of a status quo power, which is crazy. But in terms of economic exchange, the value chains, and the US is more and more actively trying to undermine them with This is something Erie Crow warned against in his memorandum time and time again. But if you look at this, do you think the U.S. Could the threat possibly come from the other side, even if accidental escalation or inadvertent escalation in the South China Sea?
So are you asking about the possibility of an accident triggering a larger war?
Yes, but also this is yes what Kevin Rudd referred to, but also whether the U.S. might be willing to act more, whether this inadvertent escalation could occur because the U.S. would be acting more, if not aggressively, then daringly, rather than China. Because if we assume China should not, short of some very escalatory action by the U.S., shouldn't probably engage in warfare, and would not be willing to. Could the risk for an onset of the war come from the other side, from the United States?
I suppose it's always possible. First of all, I think it's worth sort of um, managing our thinking about sort of this whole idea of accidental wars.
Mhm.
I'm more inclined to believe that nations have far more agency behind their actions, right? That I think it's more, the challenge is when you find that there's a nation that's determined to go to war. Uh, you know, uh, um, so it's less about sort of accidentally stumbling into a war. It's really more about discerning under what circumstances might China be so determined to go to war that it's very difficult to deter,
Mhm.
right? I think that's probably that's another way of thinking about this idea of how wars start. I think you know to go to a point that's been raised by U.S. senior leaders about potential windows, about potentially when China might act, right? Whether it's the Davidson window, 2027, maybe even earlier, according to Admiral Gilday and others. I, you know, I feel like it's important to note that even if it's true, right, that Xi Jinping has called the PLA to be prepared to take action in 2027. Um, and it's an intelligence based assessment, right, according to Director Burns. So that's fine. But I think that's very different from the actual calculation of whether she will act or not, because I think she's likely going to be influenced by a variety of other factors, some of them not related at all to the broader military balance. It may be his calculations about his domestic political standing, domestic political instability, some shock internally, unforeseen shocks that might change his calculations. It also depends on how he views US will and power at that particular time and place. It depends on how he views Japan's political will and military capability at that time and place. I mean, if you factor in all of those elements into his calculus, um, it's to me, I think I'd be very, very hesitant to put a put a timeline, if you will, specifically on when he'll specifically act. Um, but but again, I think it reinforces my earlier point, which is that I think we need to understand, we need to better understand, statesmen and countries that are determined, right? Are determined to go to war in order to resolve those disputes.
I'm terribly sorry for keeping you for this long. The, the- I swear to God, final one. Do you see analogy between West Berlin and Taiwan? Because I know how Kennan spoke. There was Kennedy. All three men, wherever they may live. But then there was Kennan who said that Soviet concerns about West Berlin are fully justified, and the U.S. is making a mistake trying to hold on to the city. Do you see this analogy as valid vis-a-vis Taiwan?
I actually think that there might be a different analogy, and it's an uncomfortable analogy, and that is Taiwan more like the Philippines in the Second World War, in the Pacific War, right? you know, trying to defend, you know, we we certainly understood that trying to defend the Philippines against Imperial Japan was going to be a very difficult undertaking, and that it would take an enormous effort to try to retake the Philippines. And the assumption was that the United States could potentially lose the Philippines. Um, I wonder if that's
Hmm.
one way of thinking about the Taiwan problem, because Taiwan represents similarly a very tough operational challenge, right? For all of the asymmetries that we've already discussed in terms of China's advantages as a local power with a variety of home court advantages, and the problems of the United States as a distant expeditionary power. So I you know, I just raise that as another potential analogy to think about. And of course, the consequences, right? Thinking through the larger strategic, political, military, economic consequences of, say, Taiwan falling. And coincidentally, there's a great report that just came out recently via the Pacific Forum that talks about sort of the broader strategic consequences should Taiwan fall, the day after Taiwan falling. Um, and I think it's worth, and in some ways, that reinforces my earlier argument about, thinking about the consequences of losing Taiwan helps to reinforce the value that the United States should attach to Taiwan. Yet, that does not necessarily resolve all of the very difficult operational challenges that the US military could find itself. And that's where I think that Philippines analogy hopefully, you know, should should make us feel a little uncomfortable, and I think rightly so.
Professor Yoshihara, thank you so much, especially for being this generous with our time. We're 20 minutes past the original time. So again, I don't want to keep you still any longer. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. I hope we'll be able to do it again.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation, and yes, I hope to have an opportunity to engage you and to exchange views again.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.